Let's go on to the constructive. If all my judges are ready. Let's begin. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them. Because I agree with Woodrow Wilson, I affirm resolved, the United States ought to promote democracy in the Middle East. Democracy is a system of government by the whole population or all eligible members of the state, and is one with representative institutions and a rule of law. The highest value in today's debate is that of justice, defined as giving each his due. We must strive to give all people what they are due, what they deserve. In order to do this, the United States government has an obligation to strive to protect the liberty of all people. Liberty is an inalienable right of each and every individual, which exists independently of any type of citizenship or any state, and stems from our intrinsic worth as human beings. Thus, the value criterion for today's debate will be protecting liberty. In other words, the way in which we measure whether democracy promotion is just or not is by looking to see which side in this debate best provides for the protection of liberty. My first major line of argument is that democracy promotion protects the liberty of both the citizens of the US and of the Middle East. The first subpoint is that democracy promotion reduces terrorism. According to Sam Choi of the University of Illinois, he explains that democratic institutions provide a formidable bulwark against terrorism for two reasons. First, when authoritarian leaders use threats of punishment and violence through corrupt authorities, citizens are incentivized to challenge the legitimacy of authoritarian rule. This often occurs through the use of terrorist violence either by themselves and or with the help of international terrorist groups. Second, democratic institutions discourage ordinary citizens from resorting to politically motivated violence over peaceful resolution in conflict. In short, democratic rule of law systems offer ordinary citizens nonviolent ways or nonviolent means of settling grievances, so they are far less likely to resort to terrorist violence as a last resort. It's clear that not only do autocracies in the Middle East help to create and in fact endorse terrorism, but promoting democracy would solve this problem. Additionally, Azim Ibrahim of the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding writes that improving our image, especially to the Middle East and especially to the Muslim world, would cripple terrorist recruitment operations and would deter citizens from joining terrorist organizations. He goes on to write that we improve our image by stopping our support for oppressive regimes and promoting democracy. Obviously, terrorism is a danger to both Americans and citizens of the Middle East, and implementing democracy would free both parties of these egregious liberty violations inflicted by terrorism. The second subpoint is that democratic institutions are vital to protect liberty. The very foundation of democracy and promotion requires individual liberty, and including the freedom of expression, the freedom to participate, the freedom to own private property, and so on and so forth. In fact, Sean Lynn Jones of the Center for Science and International Affairs concurs, writing that a democratic political process based on the electoral competition depends on the freedom of expression of political views and the freedom to make electoral choices. Moreover, governments that are accountable for their own citizens and for the public are far less likely to deprive their citizens of human rights. Even imperfect and illiberal democracies tend to offer more liberty than autocracies, and liberal democracies are very likely to promote liberty, end quote. When we examine the examples of Tunisia or Turkey, two nations in the Middle East that are developed democracies, we see that democracy is compatible with the Middle East. In Egypt and in Jordan, two nations that have specifically received democracy promotion aid from the US and are developing democracies, we see that the US's effort to promote democracy is also successful. In short, the promotion of democracy and the democratic institutions give the individual the liberty to influence his or her own government. All men and women, by virtue of their common humanity, have a right to freedom. My second major line of argument is that democracy promotion allows the US to exercise its own liberty to disapprove of the atrocities in the Middle East. Over the past decade, we've seen the formation and dominance of radical terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, ruthless dictators who are actively trying to kill their own citizens, and the genocide of minority groups. In fact, Americans witness human rights violations in the Middle East on a daily basis. The first subpoint is that the U.S. has an obligation to reject such atrocities. The U.S. is justified in intervening if and when a certain government or nation has violated the liberty of its own people. In addition, by not acting in the face of these atrocities, the U.S. tacitly approves of these egregious rights violations. Affirming allows us to avoid the moral culpability of standing by and doing nothing. The second subpoint is that promoting democracy represents a rejection of the current atrocities. Intervening in the region reflects the U.S.'s firm belief that the aforementioned actions are immoral. Promoting democracy is a key way for us to send the moral message that the violations of human rights, that genocide, that terrorism are morally repugnant and impermissible in the international community. It sends the message to the international society distinguishing right from wrong and resulting in a more just society both domestically and abroad. Democracy is a long-term solution that prevents these atrocities. Thus, this form of intervention exemplifies a rejection of the atrocities, allows the U.S. to demonstrate its liberty by sending a moral message to the world, and prevents tacit approval against these crimes against humanity, all of which protect our liberty. For the aforementioned reasons, because promoting democracy is both the right thing to do and in our best interest, we have no reason not to affirm. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us at the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Nick Costell, here with Sebastian Williams, a sophomore at Gilmore Academy. He is also involved in debate there, and we will be talking with you throughout the hour about what we're seeing and about how debate works as we're waiting for our competitors here to prepare their next arguments. Sebastian, I wonder if you could just explain quickly here, how long have you been debating for?
So this has actually been my second year debating, but I did what's called congressional debate my 8th grade year. So what that basically is just more so focusing on the specific implementations of the kind of general principles we're talking about here in Lincoln Douglas debate. So I've seen both sides of the debate. I've talked about the moral sides, kind of discussing the very principles that go into legislation, but I've also actually talked about the legislation itself.
And it looks like we are about to return to the debate in just a moment.
Whenever you're ready.
So throughout your case, you talk a lot about how democracy has positive effects such as reducing terrorism, correct?
Sure, that's the first subpoint under my first contention.
So is democracy promotion in the Middle East necessarily going to mean that these countries are becoming democracies?
Okay, so once again, let's look back to my definition of democracy. So once again, it's a system of government by the whole population and all eligible members of the state. It's one with representative institutions and one of a rule of law. So again, when a country in the Middle East becomes a democracy, it exhibits these traits.
Okay, but if you don't mind answering my question, does democracy promotion mean that these countries are going to change into a democratic form of government?
Well, yes, that's the goal.
So when the United States promotes democracy, say in Egypt, the United States is going to come in and Egypt will just transform into a democracy?
I mean, yes, that's the affirmative stance.
Could you just reiterate what are some examples of successful democracy promotion that you
I'd
talk
love
about?
to. Yeah, so once again, in my constructive, I look at Tunisia and Turkey. Not only that, but I actually advocate
Okay,
for the
so-
example. Can I finish? Do you mind?
Yeah, sure.
Also, Egypt and Jordan. Both of those countries have specifically received U.S. democracy promotion aid and are now developing democracies with successful parliaments. Not only that, you can look to examples such as Israel as well.
Okay, so what has the United States done that promoted democracy in Turkey?
Oh, no. Turkey and Tunisia are two examples of developed democracies that became democracies on their own.
Okay, so those aren't applicable to the resolution then, correct?
No. What I'm saying is that those are two prime examples about how democracy is compatible with the Middle East.
Okay, and you talk about Jordan. Jordan is a monarchy, correct?
Yes, but it also does have representative institutions and a functioning parliament that involves the political participation of the individuals.
But just to clarify, Jordan is not a democracy then?
Well, okay, once again, I'm saying that it's a developing democracy in the sense that it has representative institutions, it does have a rule of law, and it does have a functioning parliament.
So you would say that Jordan is becoming more like a democracy then?
Sure.
Okay, so would you say that it's important to consider the effects that democracy promotion policies will have in the Middle East?
Okay, so first and foremost, we should be looking to the moral obligation of the United States. And yes, after that, we can look to, the pragmatic sense of it.
So then, would you say that it's morally right or just for the United States to try and implement policies that will have significant negative effects.
Well, once again, I've kind of disproven that. Once again, look to my first contention. I say not only do we reduce terrorism threefold, but also democratic institutions provide not only a formidable bulwark against terrorism, but also liberty for each and every individual.
Just quickly, I didn't hear the threefold statistic about terrorism in your
Not,
case.
no, not threefold. There's three separate reasons,
Okay, thank you.
of course.
I negate the resolution. Resolved, the United States ought to promote democracy in the Middle East. For the sake of clarity, I will provide the following observation. It is the affirmative's burden to continue to demonstrate tangible benefits of democracy promotion, as in no world is it just for the United States to implement foreign policies that have only negative impacts on the millions of people living in the Middle East. The value for this round is justice, defined as giving each their due. The United States government must endeavor to pursue policies that result in just outcomes, both for its citizens and in the world as a whole. The value criterion is encouraging global stability for two reasons. First, in order for dues to be able to be given and received, a stable environment must exist. Without such a setting of stability, it is extremely difficult to achieve justice, and it is very difficult for countries to pursue their own just policies. Second, a stable environment throughout the world helps to ensure justice for citizens of both the United States and of other countries. With that in mind, I will offer the following two contentions to support my argument. Contention 1. Democracy promotion increases terrorism. After the U.S. entered Iraq in 2003 to topple the dictator Saddam Hussein, terrorist attacks in the country increased greatly. Moreover, terrorists in Iraq were able to innovate and develop new methods that spread to regions where they had not previously been in use. Clearly, not every form of democracy promotion would take the form of an invasion, but this example serves to illustrate how a negatively perceived foreign presence in a country can spark backlash and conflict. According to Pew polling, many countries in the Middle East have a clear negative view of the United States. Thus, United States attempts to involve themselves in these countries' politics causes anger and anti-U.S. sentiment. Illustrating this point, Robert Pape of the University of Chicago finds that the motivation of groups that carry out terrorist attacks is almost always to fight against foreign presence in the region. Furthermore, James Piazza of the University of North Carolina, after examining 30 years of data on the effects of democracy promotion in 19 Middle Eastern countries, found that democracy promotion actually increased terrorism. Therefore, we can see that the United States' promotion of democracy in the Middle East only exacerbates the problem of terrorism. Contention 2. Democracy promotion is not effective. One key factor leading to the ineffectiveness of democracy promotion is backlash from foreign governments. Richard Lugar of the National Endowment for Democracy writes that governments receiving forms of democracy assistance are increasingly unwilling to accept it, and often take measures to restrict and reduce the effects of democracy promotion. Some of these measures may include cracking down on political opponents and pro-democracy organizations. Thomas Carothers of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace explains that authoritarian political regimes have denounced democracy promotion as interference and retaliated against NGOs. In fact, in 2013, over 90 countries worldwide had prohibited foreign funding for local NGOs. Moreover, even in the rare cases where democratization occurs to the point where elections are held, it in no way means that governments beneficial for liberty and human rights will be elected. Look to the following two examples. First, in Palestine, when elections were held, the people elected Hamas, a terrorist group that continues to carry out attacks in the region. Second, in Egypt, the people elected Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, a political party that sought to consolidate power and establish theocratic rule. Clearly, even when elections take place, it does not guarantee favorable outcomes for U.S. interests or minorities in the Middle East. Walter Mead of Bard College summarizes, explaining that despite the countless amounts of time and money that the United States and European countries have spent trying to encourage the growth of democracy, their policies have not been effective. Thus, democracy promotion is not effective at causing actual, beneficial change and has the potential to actually destabilize countries. For these reasons, I negate the resolution. Now, moving on to my opponent's case, we both present the value of justice, so that's the lens that we're going to be looking at to evaluate today's round. Now, my opponent presents the value criterion of basically liberty, and I have one main problem with this value criterion, which is that people cannot exercise any liberty or have any liberty at all when the situation is unstable. For example, if it's the middle of a civil war, you are not going to have any way to choose what you want to do in your own life. You simply have to flee the situation or die. That is no liberty whatsoever, and that's the reason why we need to have stability before we have liberty. So for that reason, we have to prioritize my value criterion of encouraging global stability. So in my opponent's first contention, subpoint A, he talks about how democracy leads to a decrease in terrorism. Now, you can apply a lot of the stuff that I talk about in my own first contention, but additionally, it's important to note that his contention is contingent on democracy promotion actually leading to countries becoming democracies, which, as I show in my second contention, is certainly not the case. Secondly, even if you look at this logically, even in situations where countries do become democracies, if terrorists do not achieve their goals through democratic avenues, that doesn't mean that they're simply going to give up and be persuaded to follow other measures. So even just logically, you can see there that democracies aren't going to reduce terrorism. So, and another key issue with this is just look to my studies on this point. Remember, James Piazza looked at over 30 years of data and found that this point just simply doesn't stand up. Democracy promotion doesn't reduce terrorism. So in his subpoint B, my opponent talks about how a lot of democratic institutions protect people's rights and liberties. Again, this all depends on democracy promotion actually causing democracy, which is going to be a key point in today's debate. Additionally, he brings up a lot of examples such as Jordan, which, as I mentioned in cross-examination, is not even a democracy, it is a monarchy. So clearly that is not very relevant to today's discussion. So in my opponent's second contention, he talks about how democracy promotion allows the US to disapprove of atrocities with the subpoints of basically the United States has an obligation to do something and democracy promotion means the rejection of atrocities. So the main issue that I take with this contention is that above all else, it's not going to be justified for the United States to intervene in situations in cases where it is obvious from past examples and current evidence that intervening will only exacerbate the situation and cause more harms than benefits. It's simply not just, which is the value that we're looking at in today's round, for the United States to pursue foreign policies that are only going to harm the lives of the people living in the Middle East. And clearly you can see that democracy promotion harms countries by increasing terrorism and increasing instability. So for these reasons, I negate the resolution. Thank you.
That was Gigi Protasevich of Hathaway Brown School delivering the negative to the following resolution. The U.S. ought to promote democracy in the Middle East, and now we will continue with the debate.
Gigi,
Yes.
my judges are ready. Fantastic. Let's begin. So let's start off with your criterion of global stability. How do we ensure global stability?
Well, I would say that we don't need to 100% ensure global stability, but
Right.
the United States should take policies that would attempt to preserve stability and make sure that we're not causing
What
more
is it-
instability.
What does it mean to be stable? What does
For
that mean?
example, if a country is actively at war or involved in a civil war, then it is not stable.
Okay, so countries in the Middle East are stable. Yes or no?
Could you clarify?
It's pretty self-explanatory. Countries in the Middle East right now are stable.
I would not say so. For example, Syria is not very stable.
So what do we do when we see that they're not stable?
Well, I'm not a policymaker, but in the context of this resolution, we shouldn't promote democracy because it would exacerbate the instability that's already there.
So we should let them be on their own. We shouldn't do anything.
I'm not saying that the government shouldn't do anything. I'm saying that they should not do democracy promotion because that would harm the situation.
So then what should they do in the face of these atrocities?
Well, it's not necessarily my responsibility to promote any sort
Well,
of
yeah.
plan that the United States needs to follow.
Okay.
But when we're looking at the benefits and harms of what democracy promotion does, then clearly there are
Okay.
basically negative consequences.
Great. So you don't really touch upon the moral aspect of today's resolution. Why does the U.S. have a moral obligation to not promote democracy?
Well, I would say that it's a pretty big moral obligation not to put the lives of millions of people in the Middle East at risk, and that's exactly
Okay,
what would happen.
so let's
in a
talk about your
third world.
examples really quickly. In Iraq, what was our approach to this, to promoting democracy?
The United States intervened militarily.
Okay, so can't we just not do that next time?
Well, there are multiple different ways to promote democracy.
Right.
However, all of these policies, as I talk about, are basically going to be seen as foreign intervention, and that's going to cause backlash and an increase in terrorism.
So every single form of democracy promotion is going to cause backlash.
Well, all the forms that are the United States intervening in the politics and affairs of a country in the Middle East.
Okay, so just like to reiterate, every single form of intervention will cause backlash.
Democracy promotion specifically, yes.
Okay, so what about the successes in the Middle East? Like when we look to Egypt, or something as simple as Jordan, which does have democratic institutions.
I'm glad you brought up Egypt. I actually talk about that in my own case.
Okay.
And what happened in Egypt is currently the democratically elected government isn't even in place anymore because there was a coup that overthrew it.
Right, but now they have a parliament, right?
Well, the fact that there was a coup and overthrew it basically means that there wasn't respect for the rule of law, which you talk about as key to democracy.
Okay, but what's their current state? What's their political atmosphere right now?
Well, as I said, it's ruled by basically military leadership, the coup that overthrew it.
Okay, we'll move on. So you bring up this example of Hamas gaining power in Palestine, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so are they still in power?
I can't speak to as of this very moment,
Oh.
but I can tell you that they
That's
are still
unfortunate.
committing
Do you know-
atrocities.
Do you know what happened? Do you know what happened after they gained power in Palestine?
I believe that's time.
Okay. So, just as a brief roadmap for the judges, I plan to attack the negative and then go back and defend the affirmative stance. Okay, so if the judges are ready. Gigi?
Yes.
Let's begin. So starting off with the value of justice, I agree with this. We're looking to the dues of each and every individual. So moving on to our criterion of global stability. Now, I have a couple problems with this. First of all, it's very vague in the sense that she doesn't tell us, one, how to achieve it, or two, what it entails. Once again, like she conceded in cross-examination, there are certain countries in the Middle East that are not stable at this moment. Thus, we have to be proactive and take stances to promote democracy to make sure that they are stable in the long term. Going on to our first contention about terrorism, once again, I have a few problems with this argument. So first of all, she kind of sidesteps my three arguments that I make. First of all, that autocracies cause the problem and endorse terrorism. Second, that democracies in fact solve it. And third, that we're improving our image to the Middle East. But also, she brings up this example of Iraq. Once again, there's a couple problems here. First, when America intervened, it had no set plan. A lot of mistakes were made, not because of the problems of democracy, but because of implementation itself. So the answer is very simple. We go into the Middle East and we have a set plan and we don't intervene arbitrarily or militarily. Once again, the only example she brings up is Iraq. I've already addressed this, that this was tied to US military intervention. There's so many other ways to promote democracy. We shouldn't just be tied to US military intervention. And the idea or the country of Iraq really is irrelevant as her argument because there's so many different ways to promote democracy. Going on to our second contention about how it's not effective. First of all, once again, this contention doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Remember that there's so many ways to promote democracy. It's not fair to say that every single form of promoting democracy is going to be ineffective. Furthermore, according to the NPR and the Pew Research Center, a lot of citizens of the Middle East are proponents for democracy and actually are advocates for democracy. What agitates them the most is when foreign powers look at them and don't do anything and passively stand by, which is what we'll be doing if you negate today's resolution. Second, she brings up this idea, or the argument of Palestine and Hamas. But what she didn't answer in cross-examination is when the US and the UN Security Council took corrective measures and intervened, this was no longer a problem. Thus, once the US intervenes and takes corrective stances, this isn't an issue because now Hamas is not ruling Palestine anymore. So with that being said, let's go into my side of the arguments. So against my criterion, she only has one response, that liberty can't be reached without stability. First and foremost, we don't know what stability entails. Furthermore, she doesn't tell us how to achieve it. My advocacy is that we promote democracy to make sure that we do achieve stability. Furthermore, she doesn't refute the argument that we still have an obligation to protect liberty of each and every individual, that it is a fundamental due of each and every individual. Going on to my first contention, she says that this is just based on implementation. Once again, my third justification tells you that regardless of success, we improve our image to the Middle East and to the Muslim world. Furthermore, look to the argument that we shouldn't be looking just to implementation here, because the US can change its implementation over time. Once again, she proposes the arguments of Hamas and Egypt, and I've already refuted these, that we took corrective stances the very next year, and this wasn't a problem anymore because Hamas is no longer ruling Palestine. Against my second subpoint, she says that once again, this is based on the fact that we actually need democracy. Once again, I've already refuted the argument about past failures. We can implement democracy in so many different forms, in so many different ways, that it's not fair to say that every single type of promoting democracy is going to be a failure. Against my second contention, she said it's not justified because of the past. Once again, the argument isn't refuted, that if we don't do anything, that we're tacitly consenting to the atrocities, that we are going to be held morally culpable of the situation, that we're not protecting liberty. I've refuted on and on that this idea of past examples can be changed, that we can go back and take a different stance, that we can have an effective plan. So for these reasons, we still have no reason not to affirm.
So I'm just going to be starting off talking about the affirmative arguments, then moving on to the negative arguments, and then I will simplify today's debate into 3 main points. So my opponent and I both have the value of justice. We agree that that's what we need to be looking to when evaluating today's round, but we have differing value criterions. My opponent supports the value criterion of protecting liberty, whereas I would argue for encouraging global stability. My opponent claims that I don't refute the fact that liberty is a fundamental due. I certainly agree that liberty is something that is important, but what I'm arguing and what I have argued throughout today's debate is that you cannot have any degree of liberty when a situation is unstable. So in order for my opponent to access any sort of benefits that might promote people's liberty, he first has to have a stable situation. And you'll see that promoting democracy destabilizes situations, which makes it completely impossible for people to have any sort of liberty at all. So in my opponent's first contention, subpoint A, remember, I show you basically more examples than just Iraq. My opponent claims that I'm only telling you one example about how terrorism increased in Iraq. Recognize that that is not true. I give you the data that looked at over 30 years of data from 19 different Middle Eastern countries and found that overall, when the United States tries to promote democracy, terrorism increases. And that's going to be a key argument in today's round, because my opponent tries to argue that democracy promotion will also solve stability, will also make the region more stable. But you can see by increasing terrorism, democracy promotion clearly is only serving to destabilize the region. My opponent's subpoint B about democratic institutions, recognize that this is simply just contingent on democracy promotion actually leading to democracy. My opponent says that we don't need to defend specific implementations and look to implementation. However, what you have to see is that if the United States and European countries have been trying to promote democracy in the Middle East, in this region, for tens of years, and for a very long time, and they have tried multiple different strategies in multiple different regions, and if none of these has really been a definitive success story that we can talk about in today's round, then clearly democracy promotion is not going to be effective because of all the logical reasons that I give you. Because foreign governments that are authoritarian, when democracy is promoted by the United States in their countries, they see it as foreign intervention and they crack down and they only become more authoritarian, which harms people's liberty and harms stability. So you can clearly see that I'm even achieving both my opponent and my own value criterion right there. So looking to my opponent's second contention, again, remember what is justified. It's not justified to intervene when intervening would exacerbate the situation. My opponent says that we simply can't do nothing. That's not what I'm arguing for. I don't have to argue for the United States not doing anything in the Middle East. I have to argue that the United States should not promote democracy. And clearly promoting democracy would have more negative benefits than positive ones, and that's why I am negating the resolution. So moving on to my own case, the negative side of the debate, and against my first contention about terrorism, again, my opponent only responds by talking about how Iraq is a bad example, an example of bad implementation. I've already responded to these arguments when I was addressing the affirmatives points. So moving on to my contention 2 about democracy promotion not being effective, my opponent again talks about how there are multiple different ways. My opponent also tells you that many citizens of the Middle East want democracy, but what he doesn't tell you is that many citizens of the Middle East want democracy, but they don't want the United States' version of democracy. They don't want the United States coming into their country and trying to promote democracy and create a form of government that is similar to the United States. That's what they don't want. My opponent also talks about how in Palestine, the United States intervened again and made it so that Hamas was not basically the legitimate government as recognized by the United Nations, which somehow solved the situation and made it all better. It didn't do that. Hamas is still operating as a terrorist organization and still carries out attacks resulting in the deaths of people in the region. Whether or not the United Nations views it as a legitimate government, it is still a major presence in the region and still harming the lives of people who are living in Palestine and Israel. So just moving on to the key voting issues of today's debate, the first main voting issue is that of liberty versus stability. Now remember, stability is a complete prerequisite to having any sort of liberty. If there's a civil war and you're fleeing for your life, as in Syria, as many people are, you don't have any way to have any liberty. You can't choose what you want to do. You can't choose your own outcomes. You have no choices whatsoever. So for that reason, we need to be looking to stability before we can look to liberty. The second key voting issue is that of terrorism. And as I've shown throughout today's debate, because when the United States intervenes with any form of democracy promotion, citizens can view it as foreign intervention and it creates a backlash. And that means that terrorism is only going up in these regions, which is actually backed up by all of the data on research that has been done on the Middle East and on what democracy promotion does in the Middle East. So that's key, because if there's an increase in terrorism, obviously stability is not being preserved. And the third voting issue is the effectiveness of democracy promotion. So this is going to be a key voting issue in today's debate. As I've shown throughout my case, democracy promotion does not lead to democracy. That's not something that my opponent can just assume. That's not going to be, that's not necessarily a fact that will occur in the affirmative world. In his final speech, my opponent will attempt to tell you a story about how democracy is good and how democracy promotion will magically achieve all of these benefits. But that is all that it is. It's just a story. Because in the real world, when the United States tries to promote democracy in the Middle East, it won't achieve any of these benefits. It will only increase terrorism, increase instability, harming the lives of the millions of people in the Middle East and putting all of their lives and livelihoods at risk, which is clearly not a just way for the United States to pursue foreign policy and not a just manner of operating. So for these reasons, I continue to negate. Thank you.
Okay, really quickly, for the judges, I'm just going to boil down the round. So if the judges are ready, Gigi, let's begin. Okay, so we've already established in today's debate that there is a need for the U.S. to protect the liberty not only of its own citizens, but the liberty of the citizens of the Middle East as well. In fact, it would be hypocritical not to do so. We come home and we say that liberty is a universal due of each and every citizen, yet we don't go out universally and promote liberty. So once again, liberty is a due here. It's the most fundamental due. It's something that's intrinsic to us, intrinsic to each and every individual, and thus we must take stances to promote and to protect people's liberty. Once again, global stability is good, and we should advocate for global stability. But first and foremost, we look to liberty, not just because global stability is a prerequisite, but we have to remember that we're looking specifically to dues of each and every individual, and at the most fundamental level, we are due liberty. So the second point that I really want to emphasize is this idea of feasibility. So we know that democracy is compatible with the Middle East, and we know that it can be promoted successfully. Once again, I've discussed Turkey, I've discussed Tunisia, I've discussed Egypt, I've discussed Jordan, all of which the U.S. has used a variety of tools to handle the situation. Once again, the affirmative position can't be tied to just U.S. military intervention, which is Gigi's only example that she provides. Rather, there are so many other ways to promote democracy. There's humanitarian aid, such as education. You have substantive democracy, procedural democracy. There are so many ways, so many means that we can exercise to promote democracy. So making the blanket response that no type of intervention works whatsoever is counterintuitive and doesn't actually help us reach some type of solution. Once again, look back to the 4 examples I give you, 2 of which tell you that that democracy is compatible with the Middle East, and the other 2 showing that the U.S. promotion does actually bring about democratic institutions, and once again, these really go unresponded to. So the third point that I really want to emphasize is that there is a need to act. First and foremost, for security. That democracy results in less terrorism. I give you 3 reasons for that. That autocracies endorse and create terrorism. That democracies solve the problem. And 3, that intervening, especially to promote democracy, improves the image towards the Middle East and to the Muslim world. Furthermore, it's our best way to signal our rejections of the atrocities that we know are taking place in the Middle East, and we have to avoid culpability of the situation by promoting democracy. Furthermore, we have to understand that democracy is conducive to the protection of rights. It's a long-time solution. Once again, look back to what I say in my constructive. I show that democracy, the foundation of democracy, protects rights. And it's more than just implementation here. It's more than just solvency. GG can't just come up here and say, well, we can't look to the moral obligation because it won't work out. I've already refuted that it can and that it will work out because there's so many ways to promote democracy, but also not only is it the right thing to do, but it's in our best interest for both parties, the citizens of the Middle East and the citizens of the US. So once again, for these reasons, we have no reason not to affirm.